Okay, so most people think gum disease means just bleeding gums or bad breath. But as a dentist, I see how easily it's ignored, even though the research suggests it may reach far beyond the mouth. And studies even found DNA from gum bacteria inside the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease. And that doesn't mean gum disease causes Alzheimer's, but it does suggest a possible connection. So in this video, I'll explain why the researchers started looking into this, what the evidence actually shows, and what it could mean for your long-term health. So let's look at what the studies actually say about gum disease and dementia. And also, if you want to have a read for yourself, I've linked the studies down below in the description. So back in 2008, there was a landmark study that was published in the Journal of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and Psychiatry. And the researchers tracked over 4,000 adults, men and women, mostly in midlife, nearly for 20 years. So during that time, they recorded who developed dementia and compared it with oral health records, particularly tooth loss. Now, tooth loss was used as a marker for advanced periodontal disease because losing multiple teeth usually means years of chronic gum inflammation and bone destruction. And the results were clear. So, people with significant tooth loss had higher risk of developing dementia later in life. And the authors wrote, and I'll quote directly here: tooth loss, often a marker of periodontal disease, was associated with an increased risk of dementia later in life. Now, of course, tooth loss itself doesn't prove that gum disease causes dementia, but it reflects decades of untreated infection and inflammation. And this is one of the first large population signals suggesting that the health of your mouth and the health of your brain could be connected. Now, if we fast forward to 2017, in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, researchers followed a group of community dwelling older adults, people in their 60s and 70s who were living independently. And they split the participants into those with chronic periodontitis, that's the advanced gum disease with pocketing and bone loss, and those with relatively healthy gums. And over the study period, each participant underwent repeated memory and cognitive assessments, things like word recall and mental processing speeds. And what they found was striking. So, those with chronic gum disease didn't just perform worse at baseline, their scores declined more quickly over time. And the authors wrote that periodontitis was associated with accelerated cognitive decline in community dwelling older individuals. And in other words, the people with gum disease were aging cognitively at a faster pace, even though they were living normal everyday lives outside of nursing homes or hospitals. Again, that's not causation, but it may suggest that gum health may play a role in how quickly memory deteriorates. And then came 2019. So there was a paper in Science Advances that made international headlines. For the first time, researchers actually examined brain tissue from people who died with Alzheimer's disease. And they weren't just looking at associations in medical records anymore, they were studying the brains directly. And what they found was remarkable. So they detected DNA from Pyophilmonus gingivalis, which is the main bacteria that's behind gum disease inside the brain tissue itself. And not only that, they also found the toxic enzymes called gingipains. So these gingipains are what the bacteria use to break down gum tissue in the mouth, and they were identified in the brain. And even more striking was the pattern. So the researchers noted that the higher levels of these bacterial toxins in the brain, the more severe the Alzheimer's pathology looked under the microscope. And that's what the scientists call a dose-response relationship, the kind of signal they look for when testing whether a link might be real. And to go further, the team also experimented in mice. So they introduced Pormorphonas gingivalis orally, and the bacteria were later detected in the animals' brains. And that suggested a possible pathway, at least in animals, for how oral bacteria might migrate beyond the mouth. So, how might gum disease be connected to the changes in the brain? And the researchers pointed to three main pathways. And the first one is through the bloodstream. So, in advanced gum disease or periodontitis, the gums are not just inflamed. The tissue that lines the pockets around the teeth often becomes ulcerated. That means tiny sores form below the gum line, even though you can't see them. And this is why gums often bleed when you brush or floss. And each of these ulcerated areas can be an entry point for the bacteria. And once the bacteria from the mouth enter the bloodstream, they don't just stay local, they can circulate throughout the body and sometimes be detected in distant organs. And in the case of brain health, researchers suggest that the bacteria or the toxins they release could reach the small blood vessels that supply the brain. The second pathway is through chronic inflammation. Now, gum disease is a chronic inflammatory condition. And by chronic, I mean it lasts for years if untreated, and the body is in a constant state of immune response. And inflammation produces molecules called cytokines, which are basically chemical messengers that tell the immune system to stay on high alert. And these cytokines circulate throughout the body and not just the gums. And what does this mean for the brain? Because of ongoing systemic inflammation that can affect the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is basically a thin protective layer of cells that normally keeps harmful substances out of the brain. But chronic inflammation can make that barrier more permeable or leaky, allowing bacterial toxins, fragments, or inflammatory molecules to pass through more easily. And the third pathway that's currently being studied is through the cranial nerves. And the idea is still a bit more experimental, but animal studies suggest it's possible. Certain nerves that connect the mouth directly to the brain, such as the trigeminal nerve. So the researchers have proposed that bacteria or the inflammatory molecules they trigger could travel along these nerve pathways. It's not proven in humans yet, but it's another plausible route. And now, what happens if the bacteria or the toxins reach their brain? Laboratory studies give us some clues. For example, the Poromorphonis gingivalis, the main bacterium that's responsible for gum disease, produces the toxic enzymes which we mentioned earlier called gingipains. And in experiments, gingipains have been shown to damage the neurons and promote the same abnormal protein changes we see in Alzheimer's disease, such as the buildup of tau tangles and amyloid plaques. And to be clear, this doesn't prove that gum disease directly causes Alzheimer's, but it does show that the biology is plausible. Gum disease could act as an accelerant, adding inflammation, bacterial toxins, and immune stress to a brain that may already be vulnerable. And that's why scientists are taking the mouth brain connection seriously. Now, before we jump into conclusions, it's important to take a step back and see the limitations of the research. And the first thing is most of the studies so far were observational. That means the researchers track people over time, looking at their oral health and their brain health and see if there's a relationship. And observational studies can show association, but they can't prove causation. In other words, just because gum disease and dementia show up together, it doesn't necessarily mean one causes the other. There could be other factors at play. And the second thing is many of these studies are relatively small or based in small specific populations. For example, some cohorts included only a few thousand participants, often older adults already at higher risk, and that makes the results important, but not necessarily universal. The third thing is Alzheimer's disease itself is complex and multifactorial. Genetics, age, lifestyle, cardiovascular health, and even education levels all play a role. Gum disease may be a contributing factor, but it's unlikely to be the sole driver. And the fourth thing is even when bacteria or their toxins are detected in brain tissue, we can't be certain whether they played a causative role or whether they arrived there as a consequence of brain already weakened by disease. And this is something called the chicken and egg problem in medical research. So, what can we say with confidence? The evidence points to a consistent pattern. People with poor gum health are more likely to experience faster cognitive decline, and bacteria linked to gum disease have been found in the brain. And that makes the link biologically plausible and worth taking seriously. But it's not the same as saying gum disease causes Alzheimer's. At this stage, it's more accurate to call it a potential risk factor, one piece in a much larger puzzle. So, who should be paying closest attention to this research? And the first group is people who already have gum disease, especially advanced periodontitis with bleeding gums, loose teeth, or bone loss on dental x rays. If that inflammation has been there for years, it's not just a mouth problem, it's a systemic burden that may affect other parts of your body, potentially including the brain. The second group is older adults, and most studies looking at gum health and dementia involve people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and that doesn't mean that younger people are safe. In fact, preventing gum disease early is the best protection, but the impact of chronic gum inflammation is most concerning later in life when the brain is already more vulnerable. And the third group is people with a family history of dementia or Alzheimer's. And genetics are a strong risk factor. While you can't change your genes, you can control your gum health. And for those at a higher genetic risk, reducing any possible accelerants becomes even more important. And the fourth group, honestly, is anyone who thinks gum disease is just about losing teeth. Because even if Alzheimer's links out to be weaker than we thought, we already know that gum disease is tied to heart disease, diabetes, and other serious conditions. So, to wrap up, the evidence doesn't prove gum disease causes Alzheimer's, but it does show a consistent pattern. Poor gum health is linked with worse brain outcomes, and gum bacteria have been found inside Alzheimer's brains. And that makes one thing clear: keeping your gums healthy isn't just about your teeth, it could be about protecting your overall health. And thank you for watching.